The king's body was still warm when the rituals began. Priests swayed before the gods, chanting prayers for the soul of the dead pharaoh. Incense clouded the air. The royal court stood in silence, but one woman, the dead king's widow, was not grieving. She was waiting. She didn't weep. She calculated. Before his tomb was sealed, she had already chosen his successor, not her son, not a noble. Her younger brother. He was barely a man, soft-faced, ceremonial, trained for obedience, but his blood was pure, and purity in Egypt meant one thing: incest. Divine rule had to be passed through the sacred line, and there was no purer line than hers. That night she prepared not as a mourner, but as a seductress, bathed in milk, shaved smooth, draped in linen so sheer it left nothing to the imagination. She entered his chamber, not as sister, but as wife. This wasn't scandal, this was called statecraft. The gods demanded continuity, and she offered her body as the bridge, her womb, the future, her beauty, the crown. But when the boy began to question her hold, when he showed signs of thinking for himself, he disappeared. No body, no tomb, no inscriptions, erased. She ruled alone for years after that, worshipped, feared, then eventually hidden. Her story buried under centuries of dust and shame. But her name is not forgotten, not anymore, because she was only one of many, women who didn't just marry pharaohs. They made them, they used them, and they destroyed them. If you enjoy watching and learning about history, make sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It's incredible how we can explore history together from all around the world. In ancient Egypt, the blood of the gods flowed through the veins of kings, and to keep that blood untainted, they turned to each other. Royal incest wasn't scandal, it was theology. Pharaohs were divine, the living embodiment of Horus on earth. And like the gods, they had to marry within their own sacred circle, sister to brother, daughter to father, aunt to nephew, not out of desire, but duty, to protect the throne from impurity, to fuse bloodlines so tightly that the crown became inseparable from the flesh. But behind this doctrine was something far more disturbing. The women knew the rules, and they used them. These weren't helpless brides forced into incestuous marriages. Many of them were the architects of their dynasties. They knew that power didn't come from the sword, it came from the bedchamber. A princess could not rule alone, but if she married her younger brother, the rightful heir, she could control him, mold him, speak through him, rule beside him, or eliminate him once she no longer needed him. The divine family became a closed circle. A trap of power that turned daughters into queens and sisters into enemies. Some scholars argue it was purely political, that Egyptian elites didn't marry siblings out of desire but out of necessity, to preserve land, titles, and the sacred car that linked rulers to the gods. And in some cases, perhaps that was true, but the consequences were always human. Consider the royal family of Shon Dynasty 18, where daughters were raised knowing they might one day sleep with their brothers, where girls were trained in ritual, in charm, in fertility rites, and were told that their body wasn't just sacred, it was a tool. These were not passive figures, they were tacticians. Trained in diplomacy, temple politics, and bloodline management, their marriages weren't romantic, they were weapons. Binding contracts that kept them near the throne. Sometimes they ruled in partnership, other times they eliminated the man entirely, and when they did, they didn't cry. They commanded priests to erase names from temple walls. They reassigned gods to themselves. They stood in the pharaoh's place, as goddesses, not wives. Inscriptions from Karnak and Abydos tell stories of female gods' wives, priestesses who wielded extraordinary influence through sexual ritual and lineage. Some were married to the gods themselves, others to their own kin. Either way, they understood what most women in the ancient world never could. Their blood gave them leverage, their body gave them access, and their silence kept them alive. One scroll recovered from a noble tomb refers cryptically to a woman who knew the serpent's path to the sun. Scholars believe it references a queen who rose through incestuous marriage and ultimately deposed her own brother-husband. Her name is lost, but the pattern isn't. Over time, these unions produced more than just political heirs. They produced genetic rot, something we'll uncover later in this story. But early on, it wasn't seen as weakness, it was seen as changed divinity. To the people of Egypt, these women weren't immoral, they were sourced and sacred figures. Living extensions of Isis, of Hathor, of Ma'at. They performed fertility rites in temples. They were depicted with crowns, scepters, and bare-breasted symbols of nourishment and power. The female body wasn't hidden, it was worshipped, but only if it belonged to the right bloodline. Ordinary women had no such luxury. They lived and died unseen, but royal women, they lived inside a paradox, glorified as divine, yet trapped by tradition. Their wombs were public property, their marriages, state strategy, their desires, irrelevant. And if they resisted, they vanished. The Egyptian gods were cruel in this way. They gave women power, and then demanded blood in return. But some queens played the game better than anyone expected. They didn't just survive it. They rewrote the rules. She was born into power, but never meant to wield it alone. Hatshepsut, daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I, was married off to her half-brother Thutmose II, as expected. She was the great royal wife, a ceremonial position, fertile, loyal, politically decorative. But then her husband died. He left behind a child from a secondary wife, a boy named Thutmose III, too young to rule. Hatshepsut stepped forward as regent. The court expected her to guard the throne until the boy matured, but she had no intention of stepping aside. Instead, she declared herself Pharaoh, not queen. Pharaoh. A title no woman had dared claim before, and to do it, she had to become something else. Hatshepsut rewrote her own image. She commissioned statues of herself with broad shoulders, a muscular torso, and the traditional false beard worn by male rulers. Her name was carved into stone cartouches in the masculine form. Temple walls depicted her making offerings to the gods as a man, not a compromise, not a stand-in, but as the rightful divine monarch. She didn't disguise herself, she redefined herself. It wasn't theatre, it was strategy. Egyptian politics was not kind to women in power, but if Hatshepsut became male in symbol, she could bypass opposition. The people wouldn't follow a queen, but they would follow a god-king, and she proved herself more than worthy. Her reign was one of prosperity. She launched successful trade expeditions to Punt, filled the empire's coffers with gold, ebony, and incense, and commissioned monumental architecture, including the breathtaking temple at Deir el-Bahri, carved directly into the cliffs near Luxor. Inside its halls, she immortalized her legitimacy, not as a mother, not as a wife, but as a pharaoh chosen by the gods. But not everyone accepted her transformation. When her stepson, Thutmose III, finally came of age, he was made co-ruler in name only. He lived in the shadow of a mother figure who had stolen the crown. For years, he said nothing. But after Hatshepsut's death, he has struck back, not with armies, but with chisels. Her name was scratched from monuments, her statues defaced, her image removed from temple reliefs. For centuries, historians believed she was a minor queen, a footnote, but archaeology doesn't forget as easily as men do. In the early 20th century, excavations uncovered broken statues and hidden inscriptions that told a different story. A short and bold woman had ruled Egypt not as consort, but as king, and she had done it by embracing, then bending, the very system that tried to exclude her. Some scholars argue Hatshepsut's erasure was political, others believe it was religious, an attempt to restore Ma'at, the cosmic balance. But whatever the motive, the result was clear. A woman had ruled too well, too long, too independently, and so she was erased. But not completely. Today, we know her face. Sculpted in sandstone, dignified, serene. We know her ambition, laid bare in her funerary temple. And we know her courage, because she didn't hide behind a man. She became one. Hatshepsut's story is not just about power, it's about identity as armor. She didn't seduce. She didn't plot in the shadows. She put on the beard, took the crook and flail, and told Egypt, "I am your god now." And for 20 years, she was. She has been reduced to perfume and passion, a temptress, a lover of emperors, a woman whose beauty brought Rome to its knees. But Cleopatra VII, was never just beautiful. She was a political weapon, sharpened, polished, and used with deadly precision. Before Julius Caesar, before Mark Antony, before her legend was twisted into romantic fiction, Cleopatra, Tra was already playing a much more dangerous game. She inherited a throne soaked in blood. The Ptolemaic dynasty was infamous for incest, betrayal, and fratricide. Pharaohs married their sisters, then strangled them. Daughters were locked in temples. Sons were murdered in baths. Cleopatra was just 17 when she took the throne, alongside her 10-year-old brother. And she married him, not by choice, by law. Egyptian tradition demanded purity of blood, and so, like her ancestors, she stood beside her child brother as queen and sister wife. But Cleopatra didn't intend to be a figurehead. She began removing her brother's name from official documents. Her face appeared alone on coins. When tension rose between them, he tried to exile her, and she retaliated by raising an army. Civil war erupted in Alexandria. Enter Julius Caesar. The Roman general arrived to mediate the dispute, and Cleopatra made her most infamous move. She had herself smuggled into his quarters, rolled inside a carpet, presented like a gift. It wasn't love, it was survival. Caesar backed her. Her brother drowned in the Nile under mysterious circumstances. Cleopatra emerged as sole ruler and pregnant with Caesar's son. She went to Rome not as a concubine, but as a queen. Her presence scandalized the Senate. She wore Egyptian robes, performed rituals to Isis, spoke 9 languages. She wasn't there to bow, she was there to negotiate power as an equal. After Caesar's assassination, she returned to Egypt and soon aligned with Mark Antony, Caesar's heir in war, but rival in politics. Again, her name was mocked, seductress, manipulator. But behind the rumors was a woman, outmaneuvering Rome. Together, Cleopatra and Antony tried to build an Eastern empire. They minted joint currency, had children, declared themselves new gods. She didn't become a roe, man-wife. She tried to make him a pharaoh. And for a while, it worked. But the Roman Senate, and Octavian, Caesar's successor, feared her influence, not because she was exotic, not because she was foreign, but because she ruled like a man, and Rome wasn't built to tolerate that, so they rewrote her legacy. In Roman propaganda, Cleopatra was no longer a queen. She was a witch, a poisoner, a seductress who used her body to corrupt noble men. Her intelligence erased, her strategy recast as manipulation, her ambition called lust. When Antony fell on his sword, Cleopatra followed, not by fang, as myth says, but by poison, by choice. She died as she lived, on her terms. But Rome made sure her memory didn't survive with the same dignity. They destroyed her statues, burned her documents, declared her children illegitimate. Her son with Caesar, Caesarion, was hunted and killed. Her daughters were paraded as trophies, and her name was buried beneath scandal. But modern historians are peeling back the fiction. Cleopatra was not a love story. She was a warrior of diplomacy, raised in a palace of incest, trained to read, speak, and manipulate in 5 tongues. She used ritual, blood, ceremony, and seduction, not for pleasure, but for power. And when the men around her proved too weak, too ambitious, or too slow, she moved on. Her real crime wasn't sleeping with Caesar or Antony. Her real crime was ruling like them. Before Cleopatra, there was Arsinoe too. A queen whose name echoed through the marble halls of Alexandria like a whisper wrapped in silk and blood. She was born into the chaos of the early Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek royal family that ruled Egypt not with swords but with incest, exile, and assassination. Her father was Ptolemy I, a former general of Alexander the Great. Her mother, a Macedonian noblewoman. She was royalty from birth, but survival was never guaranteed. Her first marriage was strategic, to the king of Thrace in Lysimachus. A powerful ruler decades her senior, she became queen in a foreign land, but when court factions turned against her, she acted. Her enemies, including her own stepson, mysteriously died. When her husband finally fell in battle, she fled back to Egypt with her sons and began plotting her next move. Her brother, Ptolemy II, was already pharaoh, but he had a wife, Arsinoe, and children. That changed quickly. Arsinoe, I was accused of conspiracy and exiled. Within months, Arsinoe too married her own brother and became queen of Egypt. It was the ultimate political resurrection. Their marriage was celebrated across the empire, not for love, but for Barnos' divine perfection. Together they took the titles Theoi Adelphoi, the sibling gods. Coins were minted with her face. Statues carved her beside eagles and thunderbolts, symbols of sovereignty. She wasn't just queen, she was now a what goddess. In life, not death. And she knew how to keep it. Rivals disappeared, allies bowed. Her sons from her first marriage were declared princes. Her enemies, whether old courtiers or jealous generals, were erased. Their names removed from records, their lands seized. She ruled as co-pharaoh, not consort. Arsinoe too wasn't merely seated beside the throne. She held it in her lap, polished it with blood, and dared anyone to take it from her. But unlike Cleopatra, she didn't need Rome to validate her. She made herself sacred. She embedded her image in temple art, sponsored priesthoods, and inserted herself into the religious cults of Isis and Hathor. She blurred the lines between queen and goddess, until even the common people invoked her name in rituals. She became immortal by design. But her rise left a trail of destruction, children displaced, wives discarded, ministers assassinated. Even her step-grandchildren were sent into permanent exile, and yet, when she died, she was worshipped. Temples across Egypt and Greece held ceremonies in her name. The Ptolemaic dynasty used her image for generations, a template for power that combined beauty, fear, and divinity. Her brother husband outlived her by 10 years, but even in death she remained beside him. Enshrined in myth, carved into the stone of eternity, smiling with the serenity of a woman who knew no man had ever truly ruled her. Arsinoe too wrote the blueprint. She wasn't the last forbidden queen, but she was the first to make incest look like destiny and murder look like fate. They ruled, they commanded armies, they built temples, and then they disappeared. No tombs, no mummies, no names, just scars in the stone where their faces once were. Dynasty 18 was the golden age of the New Kingdom, the age of empire, conquest, and architectural wonder, and hidden deep within it were women who didn't just influence power, they held us it. But history tried to erase them. Take the mysterious Queen Merit-Neith. Once regent for a young pharaoh, some scholars now believe she may have ruled outright, perhaps even as pharaoh, but her name fades in the records. Her titles become vague, her statues were broken, her tomb was found, but without any identifying marks. Or the women buried beside kings with no inscriptions, no identity, only traces, bracelets with royal seals, amulets with priestly symbols. These were not concubines. They were once queens, now made anonymous. Why? Because they stepped out of line. Some ruled too long, some issued decrees in their own name, others refused to relinquish power to male heirs. They did what Hatshepsut had done, but without the political protection of divine narrative, and they paid for it. Their names were scratched off temple walls, a practice known as damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory. To the Egyptians, to be forgotten was a fate worse than death. It meant no afterlife, no eternity, no soul. And that was exactly the point. The priests, the scribes, the successors who followed them, all had a stake in restoring male order. These women had ruled, yes, but they had done so without men beside them. And that, to the conservators of Mayat, the sacred balance, was chaos. So they were erased, but not completely. Beneath the sands of Karnak, graffiti scratched into stone reveals a woman's decree, ordering the construction of a shrine using royal language, in the name of she who speaks for Ra. No name, just authority. In Tual, Amarna, the capital built by Akhenaten, fragments of relief show women in poses normally reserved for kings, one lifting the crook and flail, another making offerings to Aten. Were they queens, co-regents, rulers? We may never know, because their names were chiseled out, their eyes gouged from stone, their images recarved with male features. Modern excavations in Luxor, Abydos, and Saqqara have uncovered sarcophagi with altered inscriptions, female pronouns overcarved into male ones, statues recarved to resemble later kings, and in some tombs, entire dynastic timelines simply skip over decades where powerful women once reigned. This wasn't accident, it was for systemic erasure. And yet, fragments remain. Shards of pottery with feminine titles, letters in the Kosh Amana archives, written by women invoking treaties and trade deals, royal seals found in diplomatic caches bearing female names lost to time. The silence, it turns out, was never complete. These women didn't vanish because they were failures. They vanished because they were too successful. They had ruled without permission, and in doing so they broke the mythology of male kingship. So history closed the door behind them. But Archeo, Logi, slow, stubborn, relentless, has started pushing that door back open. Every unmarked tomb, every defaced relief, every broken statue is a clue, a voice calling out from behind the veil. I was here. I ruled. I was erased. They worshipped purity, and it destroyed them. For centuries, Egypt's royal dynasties followed a simple rule: keep the bloodline pure. Incest wasn't an aberration, it was policy. Sister married brother, father took daughter. Half-siblings wed to keep the divine spark intact, but divine blood has a dark side. Behind the gold and granite, behind the temples and triumphs, the royal family was slowly rotting from the inside out. And nowhere is that truth more grotesquely visible than in the body of Tutankhamun. For decades, the boy king was remembered for his treasures, but when his body was finally scanned with modern technology, it revealed a far more disturbing legacy. He was the product of a full brother-sister union, and his body paid the price. Tutankhamun suffered from a cleft palate, a clubbed foot, and severe scoliosis. His bones were brittle, his immune system compromised, his hips were deformed. He walked with a cane, multiple canes in fact found in his tomb, and he died before the age of 20 Tantan, likely from a combination of genetic weakness and malaria. This wasn't just bad luck, it was a generational collapse. DNA testing of royal mummies, led by Egyptian scholars like Dr. Zahi Hawass and geneticist Albert Zink, revealed a pattern: multiple pharaohs with congenital disorders, bone diseases, and skeletal abnormalities. The closer the blood, the greater the deformity. The system that was designed to keep power sacred had become a genetic death sentence. Even pharaohs worshipped as living gods couldn't walk without pain. Some couldn't father children, others were mentally impaired, and yet the incest continued, because stopping it would mean questioning the divine order itself, and that no priest would risk. The theology was too strong, the optics too vital. A pharaoh born of mixed blood might be far competent, but he would be seen as impure. So the dynasty limped forward, crippled by its own dogma, and the women, they bore the brunt of it. Princesses were raised to be brides not just to foreign kings, but to their own brothers. Their fertility was national property. Their royal wombs were dynastic vaults. Many died in childbirth, some suffered multiple stillbirths, others gave birth to sickly children doomed to short, painful lives. This wasn't hidden, it was ritualized. Texts from the Kion House of Life, the medical institutions of ancient Egypt, describe herbal remedies for pregnancy complications, ointments for genetic skin conditions, and rituals to remove impurity from the royal seed. They knew, and still they persisted. Because power demanded sacrifice, and the easiest sacrifice was the body of a woman. There are no surviving confessions, no letters of regret, but the bones speak louder than scrolls. The twisted spines, the fused joints, the underdeveloped limbs, all buried beneath golden masks and crocodile amulets, scream a truth the statues could not. In the pursuit of purity, they created decay. Some pharaohs attempted to hide it. They were painted as athletic, godlike, eternal. But forensic evidence tells another story, a story of rulers who could not walk unaided, who died in adolescence, who passed the crown to equally afflicted sons. In the end, the divine bloodline became a genetic prison. And the queens, the women who had once wielded blood like a blade, were left clutching a legacy they could no longer save. It's one of the cruelest ironies of Egyptian history. The very system that gave royal women the power to rule was also the system that made their children unfit to reign. They were queens, priestesses, sisters, mothers, and kings in all but name. They ruled empires, seduced gods, orchestrated murders, and brokered peace in the shadows of pyramids. They entered the pharaoh's chamber not as servants, but as rivals. They crowned their brothers, then buried them. They gave birth to heirs and assassins, often in the same breath. And history tried to forget them, because they weren't gentle, they weren't quiet, they didn't sit on thrones waiting to be honored. They sole took thrones when the moment came, and when it didn't come, they created it with blood, seduction, and ritual. The forbidden pharaohs, women like Hatshepsut, Cleopatra, Arsinoe, and the nameless queens whose images were gouged out of stone, didn't just challenge men, they challenged the very idea of what a ruler could be. And that was the real danger. It was never about incest. That was normal. It was never about poison. That was politics. The threat they posed was psychological. They blurred lines between man and woman, god and mortal, priestess and general. They made themselves sacred, then made themselves sovereign. They didn't ask permission, they didn't apologize. They played by the rules of divine kingship, and then rewrote those rules in their own name, and so they had to be erased. The priests buried their names, the scribes rewrote the scrolls, the stoneworkers chiseled away their faces, the Romans turned them into fables. Soft, sensual, ridiculous. Cleopatra became a lover, not a strategist. Hatshepsut, a curiosity. Arsinoe, a footnote. The nameless queens, simply forgotten. Because a woman who rules without a man beside her is still a scandal, even today. But archaeology has a longer memory than propaganda. Each broken statue recovered, each hidden inscription translated, each tomb wall re-examined. It tells the same story. These women were not accidents, they were not anomalies, they were part of the system. And they mastered it. They understood what power looked like, how it moved, how it slept, how it bled, and they used everything they had, their bodies, their bloodlines, their brilliance, to grab hold of history's throat and shake it until it whispered their names. Some ruled for years, some for months, others never got the titles they deserved, but they all forced the world to reckon with them. And now, slowly, their stories are resurfacing, not in myths, not in marble, but in the dust, the bones, and the shadows of the empire they once ruled. What they died to keep hidden was never shame. It was power. Raw, unforgivable, female. And power like that doesn't vanish. It waits, it returns, and when it does, it leaves no gods untouched.